Okay. Well, hello, friends. Welcome to this 23rd webinar on the Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. This webinar series is available on makara.us, but I bet you knew that. Under the subheading Maury Federation Webinars, then Webinar Series in Progress, as shown here. Previous episodes of this and the Secret Doctrine series are also available on YouTube. Just do a search for Francis Donald Secret Teachings or Secret Doctrine. Okay, a short review before we pick up where we left off last time. Atlantis was the home of the fourth root race, whose four subraces, because it didn't make it to 7, unfolded on 10 now submerged islands over a period of millions of years. Despite this, there are no known Atlantean ruins, documents, or artifacts, with a couple of possible exceptions, including a perfectly rendered crystal skull. Historical information about Atlantis was purportedly given to the Greek statesman Solon by the priest of Sais during one of his visits to Egypt. Solon passed this information to Critias, who gave it to his son, also named Critias, who passed it on to Plato. It is Plato's writings in Critias and Timaeus that form our understanding of Atlantis. If you happen to be a theosophist, the only other direct source are the references from HPB and DK. And let's just start off with a reading of HPB. It gives you a flavor for what this type of reference is like.
Okay, I'll read it. If the hypothesis, now so much doubted and positively denied by some learned authors who regard it as a joke of Plato's, is ever verified, then perhaps will the scientists believe that the description of the God-inhabited continent was not altogether a fable, and they may then perceive that Plato's guarded hints and his attributing the narrative to Solon and the Egyptian priests were but a prudent way of imparting the fact to the world, and by cleverly combining himself in a story which the obligations imposed at initiation forbade him to divulge. Is that all one sentence?
Maybe. Let me see. I don't see
No,
any
I see
period
a
in there.
period halfway through.
Oh, okay. 2 sentences. Well, that's typical HPB length of sentence right there. Yeah, she DK's been known to have some long ones too. So this is a unique take, you could say, on Plato's motive, right? That he cleverly combining truth and fiction, thus disconnecting him with the story, which otherwise would have, the obligations of initiation would have forbidden him to divulge, right? So it's interesting take on it. Of course, there are other valuable writings on Atlantis, most notably MPH's later analysis of Atlantean mythology. I say later because we're reading this Secret Teachings of All Ages from 1926, 7, somewhere in there. And this came out a decade or so later. So he had developed this theme quite a bit in this pamphlet. It's actually quite impressive. Also, the in-depth scientific and ethnographic observations of Ignatius Donnelly, and more narrowly, but still importantly, John Mitchell's geometrical analysis of the capital city measurements given by Plato. Last month, after looking at possible locations for the lost continent as indicated by the geological record and the prominent role Neptune/Poseidon played in the Atlantean creation story, we took a look at Poseidon's son, Atlas, who personified Atlantis, as shown by the fact that the fourth root race, Axis Mundi, the great central mountain, was named after him, called Mount Atlas. So let's start by rereading the paragraph that we ended up on last time, in the middle of last time, and then we'll take it from there. Can we get a reader for this, please?
Yes.
And like I said, the illustration on the left shows where we are in the big book, page 33, the big book of the secret teachings. Go ahead.
The description of the Atlantean civilization given by Plato in the Critias might be summarized as follows. In the first ages, the gods divided the earth among themselves, proportioning it according to their respective dignities. Each became the peculiar deity of his own allotment and established therein temples to himself, ordained a priestcraft, and instituted a system of sacrifice. To Poseidon was given the sea and the island continent of Atlantis. In the midst of the island was a mountain which was the dwelling place of three earth-born primitive human beings, Avenor, his wife Leucippe, and their only daughter Cleito. The maiden was very beautiful, and after the sudden death of her parents, she was wooed by Poseidon, who begat her 5 pairs of male children. Poseidon apportioned his continent among these 10, and Atlas, the eldest, he made overlord of the other 9. Poseidon further called the country Atlantis, and the surrounding sea the Atlantic, in honor of Atlas. Before the birth of his 10 sons, Poseidon divided the continent and the coastwise sea into concentric zones of land and water, which were as perfect as though turned upon a lathe. 2 zones of land and 3 of water surrounded the central island, which Poseidon caused to be irrigated with 2 springs of water, one warm and the other cold.
Thank you. Okay. Any thoughts or questions in general about this paragraph? Okay. Picking up where we left off, we learned that Mount Atlas is the home of Avenor, Leucippe, his wife, and their only daughter, Cleito. Let's take a look at a quote from MPH's Atlantis and Interpretation to get a perspective on the philosophical meaning behind this original trinity. Could we get a reader, please?
Andrea, can...
Yeah. Having received his allotment, Poseidon began the process of fashioning his world. The humid ethers of the watery diffusion were divided by the Greeks into 2 parts, the one denoting a spirituous state and the other a grosser or sedimentary. Working through the higher parts of the ether upon the lower parts, therefore, Poseidon is said to have brought them together or united them. The higher ether was called Avenor, and the lower ether Leucippe. From their union was produced Cleito, or the etheric body of the solar system. Cleito is referred to as an orphan because her very emergence was the result of the union of the extremes which produced her. And the extremes themselves ceased to exist when their equilibrium had been accomplished. As hydrogen and oxygen disappear as pure elements in the visible compound of water, so the etheric extremes lost their identity in their own progeny. Atlantis and Interpretation 25.
Thank you. So you see, we've moved way into the allegorical aspect, the noumenal aspects of the creation story, right? From the very physical aspect of this described here, same author, but now some years later has given us this understanding. But before we get into this, let's read a bit further. The maiden was very beautiful, and after the sudden death of her parents, she was wooed by Poseidon, who begat by her 5 pairs of male children. As we just learned, the sudden death of Cleito's parents came about because, quote, the extremes themselves, higher and lower ethers, ceased to exist when their equilibrium had been accomplished. So, according to MPH, Cleito represented nothing less than the etheric body of the solar system, as you could see there in his text. This would be true, in my opinion, if the genesis of Atlantis was a solar systemic event. But as we know, Atlantis was the 4th phase of the repeopling of our current globe. As the author here suggests, since the story of Atlantis is ultimately about the physical creation of root race, it seems to me altogether fitting that the daughter of the god of that root race would represent the united lower physical ethers, not the cosmic ethers. It's just my opinion. Happy to hear arguments on that. Let's look at another passage from MPH's inspired interpretation.
Lynn, can you read that, please?
When the human body, would that be human or
Humid,
the humid body,
as in wet.
thank you, of the solar system, the planet was prepared, the god Poseidon took upon himself a humid form, described in the Chaldaic oracles as serpentine, that is, vibratory. In this form, he united with Cleito, and from this union was born a tetractys, the Pythagorean pattern of 10 dots, the key to the entire formula of material generation. These 10 dots are likewise the 10 brothers, the framework of the material world and the common denominator of all magnitude and multitude.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. Any thoughts or questions about this very clear and informative passage? So, when Poseidon, as the noumenon of the universal generative power, united with Cleito, representing the combined higher and lower ethers, she gave birth to the key to the entire formula of material generation in the form of the tetractys. This is not yet physical generation, but rather the energetic pattern by which all outer forms might come into being. So, Cleito becomes the link between the noumenon and the actual generation by giving birth, or actually representing the energetic pattern, the tetractys, that all outer forms are determined by. Next, Poseidon apportioned his continent among these 10, and Atlas, the eldest, he made overlord of the other 9. Poseidon further called the country Atlantis and the surrounding sea the Atlantic in honor of Atlantis. According to 7th century BC Athenian statesman Solon, the name Atlas remained unchanged from the original, the Atlantean original, whereas the names of all the other 9 princes of Atlantis went through a double translation, first to the Egyptian, then to the Greek. Could we get a reader? And I would recommend
Right.
our Greeks.
Okay.
Veronica, or
We have Anne Veronica and we have Efrosini. So Anne Veronica, can you read this?
Hear me?
yes.
Yes.
Welcome.
I'm not sure the way they are written in English that I will be able to say them in a Greek way, but I'll
It's
try.
going to be better than what we can do, I'm sure.
The 5 pairs of children received the names in this: Atlas, Evmelus, Amphireus, Evaiemon, Mnesos, Otoson, Elysipos, Mestor, Azaeas, Diaprepas. It is to be understood that these are the Grecian forms of the original names. Solon declared that the Egyptians had taken the Atlantean names and adapted them to the language of their own country. He, in turn, had taken the Egyptian names and had Grecianized them. This is stated positively in the dialogue, Atlantis, an interpretation, Solon of Athens.
Thank you, Anne Veronica.
Thank you.
So, just to mix things up a bit, while making an argument against the existence of Atlantis, George Faber forwards a different, but to me, fascinating etymology for the name Atlas. Could we get a reader for this, please? BL?
Yeah, let me do it. Did you, oh, there she goes. Go ahead, Joe.
This imaginary northern nation of Mbele, Atlantis, was in fact the whole body of antediluvians, who were indifferently termed Atlanteans and Titans. Atlanteans, from their devotion to the worship of At-al-As, the divine sun, and Titans from Tit, the deluge.
Thank you. So I've included this because, you know, even though he's basically saying all humanity before the existence of the what's called historical, the historical cultures that peopled Europe, that all humanity before that were indifferently termed Atlanteans. You know, which we know from many other sources not to be the case. But I included this because this name fascinates me, spelled this way, Atalas, the A representing spirit, which pervades the entire word, and the 3 continents conditioning the form aspect. This is something you see in Egyptian a lot, where the vowels are missing and we're left with just the form. Therefore, we no longer have a direct connection to the original magical potency, but we can derive something of the form that it related to. So next, before the birth of his 10 sons, Poseidon divided the continent and the coastwise sea into concentric zones of land and water, which were as perfect as though turned upon a lathe. 2 zones of land and 3 of water surrounded the central island, which Poseidon caused to be irrigated with 2 springs of water, one warm and the other cold. Donnelly's Atlantis, the antediluvian world, gives us further details on this part of the myth. Could we get a reader, please?
Yvonne, can you read that for us, please?
Poseidon, breaking the ground, enclosed the hill in which Cleito dwelt all round, making alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, which he turned, as with a lathe, out of the center of the island, equidistant every way, so that no man could get to the island, for ships and voyages were not yet heard of. He himself, as he was a god, found no difficulty in making special arrangements for the center island, bringing 2 streams of water under the earth, which he caused to ascend as springs, one of warm water and the other of cold, and making every variety of food to spring up abundantly in the earth.
Thank you. So this is fine as far as it goes. It's just a more detailed reading of the Plato. But for an esoteric understanding of these events, we'll need to, once again, turn to MPH. So could we get a reader, please?
Joan, can you read that for us, please?
Atlas is a form of Adam. Both names are derived from the root at or ad. As Adam was the first of the 10 patriarchs, so Atlas is the first of the 10 princes of Atlantis, and the monad is the first and chief of the numerations. Atlas, representing the monad or unity, is therefore given rulership over the whole world, which he must support by the principle of unity. In other words, the universe is sustained by its own oneness. The other brothers, each of whom esoterically represents a law and the principle working within and under unity, are given principalities. That is, they are assigned spheres of manifestation. They are given rulerships over orders of seminal life. In the meantime, Poseidon, as the great sea serpent, runs the waters of space into the nebular spherical form of the globe. The key to the symbolism is apparent, for in the account of Atlantis, Poseidon is described as turning out the concentric zones as though upon a lathe, even and symmetrical in all their parts. In the midst of the bands or zones is a mountain rising in the middle of the imperishable land or island.
Okay, and to continue, reader, please.
Yes. Sorry, Scott.
We know from the Egyptians and the Greeks that this central mountain represents the sun in the solar system. And in the planetary arrangement, the polar mountain, Meru or Olympus, the abode of the gods. This part of the symbolism could be developed at great length. In the Norse theology, the mountain Asgard, with its 3 temples, rises in the middle of the earth and is surrounded by the zones and sea, the outer extremity of which is a wall formed of the eyebrows of Ymir, the primordial giant, a type of Atlas. Plato referred to the central island of Atlantis as an acropolis, where are gathered temples and great buildings, which surround the golden domed shrine of Poseidon. Here Poseidon is the invisible sun, which, in the words of Paracelsus, lights the humid worlds as our physical sun lights the material world. The zones with which Poseidon surrounds the central island represent the orbits of the planets, 5 in number. In the old Atlantis system, the sun and the moon were not planets. In the development of the Earth itself, these zones are the magnetic bands which have descended to us under the symbolism of the 5 belts. That is, the equator, the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn and Cancer, and the Arctic and Antarctic circles.
Thanks, Scott. Any thoughts or questions? So, on the one hand, Donnelly gives us a fantastic but at least semi-historical physical plane unfoldment. And on the other, MPH gives us an esoteric allegory that might be summed up by the quote, "Here Poseidon is the invisible sun, which in the words of Paracelsus lights the humid worlds as our physical sun lights the material world." The humid world refers to both Piscean astrality, the sign under which Atlantis was formed, and the entire pre-physical generative matrix, which is considered humid. and whose symbol is the tetractys. And we might speculate it also refers to the astral plane on which the Atlanteans were uniquely polarized. This passage, Scott, you had something?
But yeah, I was thinking a couple of things here. One of these is, it seems to be each of these passages seems to be a mix, as Plato deliberately did in mixing maybe fact with fiction, or a small island with the whole continent. It seems to be a mix of this lower subplane of the physical plane, but it also seems to be much larger than that. We're talking here of a solar system as well, or even more cosmic.
Yeah.
Different levels here.
Definitely. Yeah, I spent some time trying to get a unified theory out of this and wasn't able to. He says at one point, let me see if I can find it, going back. Where was that? No, it was in his writings. Yeah, well, here I left out a T. Here he specifically describes the etheric body of the solar system, but then he says here, when the humid body of the solar system of the planet was prepared, suggesting that this reference was really, that included the entire solar system, was actually planetary, which is an odd choice of words, and it gave me some pause. But yes, there's definitely some duality going on here.
And the tetractys is certainly a 10. I don't see it immediately as pairing up as it was described as brothers or a pair of couples. I don't see the tetractys folding out that way. I see a 1, 2, 3, and a 4, but I don't see pairs.
Yeah, actually, here he describes it as Poseidon uniting with Cleito gave birth to the tetractys, which he calls the entire formula of material generation. So to me, that makes more sense than rather than pairing them directly with the 10 princes. Because what you have here is the matrix for physical generation or material generation, which is, it's natural that his, quote, daughter, unquote, would represent that matrix, since Poseidon is at this noumenal level. But yeah, then he goes on to say, and I agree with you, that the 10 brothers represent the total dissemination. You could say what's the word that DK uses? And their legion, and their name was Legion because from these 10 came the entire population of Atlantis, right? These 10 and their wives. And so you have in that the full and final extension of manifestation. So in that sense, I can see that it can represent these 10, but only in that looser understanding.
Yeah, maybe it's odds and even numbers. I don't know. The other thing I was noticing was the 5 he comes up, which just seems to me is a happy coincidence. Using 5 planets instead of 7 or 6.
Oh,
pulling in the 5 bands around the Earth. I don't know about that. What does he go into that any further? Does he try and explain which planet is which of the 5?
No,
I don't think so.
He doesn't. It's really it's about a 30-page pamphlet, and his focus is not as so astrological as that. However, a deep dive into the periodicals, the MPH, that I've quoted here might bring further info on that up. But
Right. Maybe
yeah, what he's doing is equating the 5 with the 5 physical zones of the planet, right? Is that what you were talking about?
well, that and the planets. Up above that, paragraph 5, a number of the planets, the orbits of the planets.
Yeah, Francis, can you go back to that image that has the planets in it? I'm thinking, Saturn
one.
inward. Yeah, I'm thinking Saturn inward because they didn't consider the Earth at that point. They considered the sun, and that wasn't considered one of the planets. So that would be the Saturn inward would be Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, right?
So let's see. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Yeah, it seems to me. I mean, you have the 7 usual suspects minus Moon and Sun.
Yeah, I don't recognize those 2 top ones, though. That doesn't look like Jupiter to me or Saturn, but it looks like maybe a...
Well, oops. Here, I'm going to have to come out of the hole here. What I can do here. I can bring this up. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be a scythe there, which would represent Saturn,
Yeah,
but I'm not sure what that is. It
Well,
would represent Jupiter, but they knew of Jupiter.
I think that's the fasces and symbols of empowerment there for Jupiter. The crossed arrows and the...
Yeah. Though I think that is the 2, 4, 6. Yeah, the sun is there, but they said they didn't consider the sun a planet. So I think those would be the 5 then.
Yeah, of course, this is called the scheme of the universe according to the Greeks and Romans. This is, and he included this, and this often happened with these illustrations. He included this, in the chapter on Atlantis, but it's not strictly accurate to that Atlantean philosophy. It was, I think, last time, the very beginning of the last webinar, we read the info in this, which is he gives the names here. The planets of Mercury is reached. Above Mercury is the planet Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the latter containing the symbol of the zodiacal constellations. Anyway, I don't want to spend any more time on this. That's
okay. Then we have another comment. Susan says, what do you mean that the Atlanteans were astrally polarized?
Well, that's a big question, and we will look at that in depth when we get to DK's commentary on Atlanteans. I'd say 9 out of 10 comments by DK on Atlantis talk about Atlantis as the 4th root race in which the astral plane became the rulership because the emotional body was developed during that time, and that the mental body was very much in an embryonic condition, which is what allowed for their lower psychism to develop. Interestingly, we were just reading about that today in Esoteric Psychology 2 in class, that there was just no barrier. The concrete mind forms a barrier between lower psychism demonstrating, and in Atlantis that just wasn't there. So there was the development of the astrality, and that means that their sense of self was purely astral. That's still a dominant condition today, though mental development, of course, is well underway. DK says 2/3 of the population of the Earth is still astrally polarized, meaning that they have their recognition of self and of the truth of being, you could say, on in their astral body. And this could be true, by the way, and I mentioned this in class, of a PhD. It doesn't just mean those who haven't developed mind. It has to do with the sense of self, the sense of identity, and therefore the habits of daily life and how they're manifested. Hope that helps. Okay, let's get back to where we were and see if I can recover this. Yeah, okay. Any other thoughts or questions? I just wanted to recenter here before we go forward.
Christine says, which is where we are now as descendants.
What is where we are now as descendants?
I think what you just
You mean
said.
about astrality?
Right, and
yeah, we were all there. I mean, not every single one of us, but a great majority of us incarnated in Atlantis. It was an interrupted root race. Had it gone through its last 3 sub races, they would have fully integrated the astral body, and we would have started with that having been accomplished. But now we have to play catch up in the 5th root race, integrating the astral and the mental in this race. So double duty. That's why everyone's so exhausted. Any other questions?
no, that's
Okay, let me get back to play mode here, and we'll continue. Okay. In this passage, MPH describes a central or polar mountains, the Axis Mundi, which represents the abode of the gods, and more esoterically, the sun. For the ancient Greeks, this was Mount Olympus. For the Sioux tribe of North America, it was Harney Peak, now renamed Black Elk Peak. And for the Tibetans and Hindus, Mount Meru, considered by esotericists to be the Axis Mundi for the 5th root race. Thoughts or questions on anything in this very full paragraph? There's much here. Okay, next up, can we get a reader, please?
sorry. Susan, can you read that for us, please?
Sure. The descendants of Atlas continued as rulers of Atlantis, with wise government and industry, elevated the country to a position of surpassing dignity. The natural resources of Atlantis were apparently limitless. Precious metals were mined, wild animals domesticated, and perfumes distilled from its fragrant flowers. While enjoying the abundance natural to their semi-tropic location, the Atlanteans employed themselves also in the erection of palaces, temples, and docks. They bridged the zones of sea and later dug a deep canal to connect the outer ocean with the central island, where stood the palaces and temple of Poseidon, which excelled all other structures in magnificence. A network of bridges and canals was created by the Atlanteans to unite the various parts of their kingdom.
Thank you. So again, we'll turn to Donnelly, very jaunty looking on the left there. Donnelly's translation of Plato, that is, for more detail. Can we get a reader?
Yes. Joe, can you read that for us, please?
They arranged the whole country in the following manner. First of all, they bridged over the zones of sea which surrounded the ancient metropolis and made a passage into and out of the royal palace. And then they began to build the palace in the habitation of the god and of their ancestors. This they continued to ornament in successive generations, every king surpassing the one who came before him to the utmost of his power, until they made the building a marvel to behold for size and for beauty. And beginning from the sea, they dug a canal 300 feet in width and 100 feet in depth and 50 stadia in length, which they carried through to the outermost zone, making a passage from the sea up to this, which became a harbor, and leaving an opening sufficient to enable the largest vessels to find ingress. Moreover, they divided the zones of land which parted the zones of sea, constructing bridges of which a width as would leave a passage for a single trireme to pass out of one into another, and roofed them over. And there was a way underneath for the ships, for the banks of the zones were raised considerably above the water.
Okay, a lot of descriptive stuff, but it's one way to vision this Poseidonus, which is the central city of Atlantis, and we helps us to actually get a feel for what the place might have been like. Any thoughts or questions about this?
Yes, from Efrosini, she says, the Tibetan, oops, just lost it. The Tibetan tells us that all the achievements of the Atlanteans were the gifts of the white brotherhood to the immature, unintelligent people. I wonder if Cleito's twins can relate to the division between the white and the black brotherhood that culminated in the Great Atlantis War.
Well, that's a very interesting thought. I tend to relate them more to the syzygies of the Gnostics, which are these different pairs of opposites. I don't think in the beginning that the Black Brotherhood had any hold at all on the Atlanteans. That only developed. You have to remember, that it was an entire root race, or at least 4 subraces of a root race, and it took millions of years to unfold. And when these 10 princes came into being, and according to MPH, they're really principles. But I have no problem with them being both physical realities, like Atlas himself, who is, the underlying principle that upholds the entire world, as well as a mountain, as well, which is the axis mundi, around which that root race revolves, as well as the senior among these 10 princes. I think all can exist simultaneously. But anyway, since it existed for millions and millions of years, it was only in the latter times that the Dark Brotherhood's hold became unbreakable, really, and it had to be forced by the hierarchy of that time, right? And we're going to be taking a close look at that as we progress here. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on it. But thanks for your thoughts. It's interesting. Okay, anyone else?
That's all I see for now.
Okay. Next up, new paragraph. Could we get a reader, please?
Lynn, can you read that for us, please?
Plato then describes the white, black, and red stones which they quarried from beneath their continent and used in the construction of public buildings and docks. They circumscribed each of the land zones with a wall, the outer wall being covered with brass, the middle with tin, and the inner, which encompassed the citadel, with orichalch. The citadel on the central island contained the palaces, temples, and other buildings. In its center, surrounded by a wall of gold, was a sanctuary dedicated to Cleito and Poseidon. Here the first 10 princes of the island were born, and here each year their descendants brought offerings. Poseidon's own temple, its exterior entirely covered with silver, and its pinnacles with gold, also stood within the citadel. The interior of the temple was of ivory, gold, silver, and oriclach, even to the pillars and the floor. The temple contained a colossal statue of Poseidon, standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, about him 100 nereids riding on dolphins. Arranged outside the building were golden statues of the first 10 kings and their wives.
Thank you, Lynn. Any thoughts or questions? So we continue with this physical description. Plato's Critias tells us that orichalc, also called orichalcum, was an extremely durable, red-hued, precious metal, unknown in the modern world, and prized above all others except gold. It was on columns clad in this metal that Poseidon's laws were engraved, as shown in this still of a 3D graphic. In the detail on the right, you can just make out a figure at the base of this column of laws, revealing the monumental size of the temple, at least in the artist's imagination, but in accordance with according to Plato, it was 300 by 600 feet, quite large. Next, let's get a reader for this first.
Okay, I'll read it. Now the relations of their governments to one another were regulated by the injunctions of Poseidon, as the law had handed them down. These were inscribed by the first men on a column of orichalcum, which was situated in the middle of the island at the temple of Poseidon, whither the people were gathered together. Here they received and gave judgments, and at daybreak they wrote down their sentences on a golden tablet and deposited them as memorials with their robes. There were many special laws which the several kings had inscribed about the temples.
Thank you. Okay.
We have a number of hands.
Okay.
Scott, you want to go first, and then Anna.
Yeah, going back to the 3 metals, the two of which we know about. The other translation of this, I think, is more correct for the second, because it's brass and bronze, or what are written elsewhere as the 2. And my interest was in what's the difference. So I was looking into that. They're both made of copper. But the brass is made with zinc, and the bronze is made with tin.
Oh, so it relates to 2. Yeah.
Right. So if the outer one would be seemingly the outer temple wall, that's going to be of less value as you move in. So what's the difference then between brass and bronze? And so looking at brass with zinc, they're all electrical conductors. The brass has a bright gold appearance. It's very durable and resists corrosion.
Right.
And the tin is made, or the bronze is made with tin, and tin is the metal of Jupiter. It's the metal of sages and scholars and philosophy. It's very Sagittarian and Jupiterian combination. So there's strength and courage in the brass. It's more martial, perhaps. And then there's the tin with Jupiter, and then there's this mystery one, the red.
On the inside. That does seem more progressive. I like that.
I figured it has to be somehow, so I'm trying to put it together, but I'm not sure I've got it. But that's what I found. Zinc protects against harmful substances and radiation, which is dealing with the brass as an outer.
As the outer shield.
Yeah. Looking at it, what herbalists and people who work with metals in terms of healing, This zinc supposedly supports the immune system, promotes abstract thinking, spontaneity. It's protective, though, in particular. And the other thing about it, about tin, is that it's tetrahedral in its construction, whereas the other 6 metals are octahedral, which is interesting. It makes it special. The other 6 planetary metals are octahedral. This one is tetrahedral, more fundamental. And Jupiter.
Right. And, you know, since all of these are of a piece, I mean, all of the aspects of the description of this place are of a piece. You know, this isn't, you know, this is certainly not random, what you're pointing out here, that this is going to be progressive and have this very specific meaning having to do with its qualities, the nature of its qualities. And yeah, I have no doubt that its planetary rulership, you know, comes to bear, especially because Jupiter was very important to Atlanteans.
Yeah, and the metal that, of course, the brass and bronze share is copper, which is Venusian, and it's known for its translation of heat and electricity, and its malleability. But it's Jupiterian plus, or sorry,
Venusian.
plus Jupiter, or Venusian plus whatever we want to put zinc with. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't. And what about orichalc? Isn't that something?
I don't know. That still seems to be a mystery. Did you find anything more of that? It's
only, you know, what I just read, which is that it's described as being extremely durable, and it may have been used in Egypt for what are called the Pillars of Enoch, which was where all of this was recorded. And we'll come to this, but there was a philosopher, BC Castor, I can't remember now, but we'll come to it, who said that he knew someone who had seen those pillars of Enoch, and this was in some centuries BC. And they were said to be made of a material that they didn't use this word, orichalc or orichalcum, but of a unknown material of particular durability. So who knows?
right, and those are perhaps like the ones that are supposedly buried in the desert in Egypt, in the citadel, that have inscribed on them the history of the world going back 800,000 years or more, or whatever. We've heard of those elsewhere.
Yeah, and you know, if you think about the opening phrases of the Secret Doctrine, well, I should preface this by saying I have no doubt, let's get back up to this, it's more fun to look at. I have no doubt that this material physically exists or existed, but it just makes me think of when, you know, when HPB says, you know, I'm looking at these leaves of an impermeable, indestructible material, right? And, you know, we always just assume that, well, they're impermeable and indestructible because they exist on higher planes, right? That they're etheric or beyond, and therefore they can't be, they're not subject to the vagaries of, you know, the physical planes. But, you know, it makes you wonder if she wasn't seeing those with her inner vision, wasn't seeing something like orichalc with her inner vision, you know, when she was reading those initial images of the circle and with the point in the center, etc.
It may be a mineral that doesn't exist actually, but it takes an alchemical transformation to produce.
I like that. Yeah, I like that.
Francis and Scott?
Yeah.
Efrosini says orichalc in Greek means mountain of copper, and copper is the metal of Venus in alchemy. And then I looked it up. I looked it up on the internet, and it says in numismatics, orichalcum is the golden colored bronze alloy used by the Roman Empire for their, Sestertius and Dupondius coins.
Huh. Okay,
So
so it had some usage.
that's an alloy is what they're talking about there, which is, I think, what Scott just said, right?
Yeah, but I doubt the Romans used it either as coins, and since they only had the lesser mysteries, I'm sure they don't have the real deal.
Yeah. You know, there's always going to be the outer, and then the demonstration of the noumenal in all of this stuff, including this progression of metals. So in order to really understand, you have to be able to break that code, you know, of the noumenal meaning of behind this, you know, and you can't do it from the outside in, I don't think. At least that's how I understand it. Okay, any other thoughts?
Her hand has gone down, but Anna had her hand up a minute ago. Anna, did you have a question?
Okay, let's move on. If she does, she can come back.
Okay.
So next in the analysis of this paragraph, the citadel on the central island contained the palaces, temples, and other public buildings. In its center, surrounded by a wall of gold, was a sanctuary dedicated to Cleito and Poseidon. Just for fun, here are some additional 3D graphics of the central island, the connecting bridge, and a full shot of the interior of the temple we've been looking at here. All from a, ready for this, user-controlled walkthrough style 3D imaginative recreation of Atlantis by a company called Ubisoft. You can actually buy the software and just take a tour in U-Control. It's not a video, it's a 3D walkthrough. So you can go where you want, in and out of temples, walking around, and there's people walking by, etc. It's pretty amazing. And as you can see, it's some pretty beautiful graphics involved in this. Accurate? Well, who knows? It depends on the intuition of the creators of the software. So let's finish the description of the temple complex, the city center, in this short little paragraph.
Scott, can you read that for us, please?
In the groves and gardens were hot and cold springs. There were numerous temples to various deities, places of exercise for men and for beasts, public baths, and a great race course for horses. At various vantage points on the zones were fortifications, and to the great harbor came vessels from every maritime nation. The zones were so thickly populated that the sound of human voices was ever in the air.
Okay, so Plato gives precise measurements for many of the land zones, canals, bridges, and temples, a listing that continues for several pages. For me, these measurements seem to carry some hidden meaning other than just descriptions of the city's proportions. While this is being read, keep in mind that stadia is plural for the Greek stadion, a measurement of approximately 183 meters or 600 feet. Could we get a reader for this section?
Carrie, can you read that for us, please?
Now, the largest of the zones into which a passage was cut from the sea was 3 stadia in one breadth, and the zone of land which came next of equal breadth. But the next 2, as well the zone of water as of land, were 2 stadia, and the one which surrounded the central island was a stadium only in width. The island in which the palace was situated had a diameter of 5 stadia. This and the zones and the bridge which was the sixth part of a stadium in width. They surrounded by a stone wall, on either side placing towers and gates on the bridges where the sea passed in. The stone which was used in the work they quarried from underneath the center island and from underneath the zones, on the outer as well as the inner side.
Thanks, Gary. Okay, at some point we're going to get into John Mitchell's philosophical analysis of these measurements. It's really fabulous, revelatory, really. Yes, Scott, I saw your hand.
Not going to go into that. What seems to be cast off here in a single sentence or two seems to me really important and fascinating. What we're looking at here is the central city on Poseidonus of Atlantis, but we know it to be a huge continent about which nothing is said except where it just mentioned every maritime nation sent its ships there.
Yeah.
And there's no mention of what those nations are, who they were, where they were.
That is indeed the case. The
It just leaves
entire
you going,
focus of Plato's description is on what may have been a city called Poseidonus. It was certainly the central city of Atlantis. And there's some puzzling aspects to that. He does talk about the immediate environs of the city that goes out some miles towards the central mountain. But as to the provinces that, we can assume that the central city was also under the rulership or provenance of Atlas, being the senior brother. But that leaves 9 other provinces of an entire continent, of which basically nothing is said, except for the metals of every kind, plants of every description. Agriculture was all of the highest and most abundant availability. But beyond that, nothing.
we were told, or we not, I'm sure you will cover or have covered it, that this island of Poseidonus, which was the last island, the small island that went down 11, 12,000 years ago. And Plato deliberately conflated what was happening there with the original continent that had already disappeared, the real huge continent of Atlantis that had already gone down.
Yeah, that's one of the somewhat puerile way this is described, which is, there's a lot of detail about the 10 princes, Cleito, Evenar, Leucippe, and Poseidon, which was the establishment, and that would have been millions of years ago, and the design that was clearly inspired by those events in the beginning. And then jump forward zillion years to the destruction phase. And there's, obviously over a period of millions of years, you have had the development of all 4 of the subraces of the Atlantean root race. And HPP goes into this, and I'm going to be offering this at the end. I haven't done the research yet of this section of, for instance, the sense of hearing wasn't even developed until the 3rd subrace of the Atlantean race. The sense of sight was developed before the sense of hearing. I mean, all these types of things, you realize how primitive the sensory equipment was in those earliest subraces. So we'll take a closer look, but we have very focused and limited information. And we don't really know the name of any of the cities or islands, right? At all. What we know is that Mount Atlas was there and was the Axis Mundi. And there was a major city that was described, as in this, very much like you see here in this description, right? That's it, not much else. So I will be mining HBB for more information, but in terms of the Critias and the Timaeus, it was mostly a description of this central city, and it was the last vestige. And HBB said that had little to do with the earlier instances of the race, that it was at this point, the Dark Brotherhood had really taken hold. So who knows? Who knows?
This city may be, in fact, actually of the earlier race, earlier part of the race entirely. And he just put it on Poseidonus at that last island that went down, but it wasn't actually there. That was from something prior, something earlier. And he just brought it forward so you could have that, but it was not actually on that last island.
I would say it's real likely, in fact, that there is a conflation of that, and that might have been part of the blind, who knows? Anyone else?
Yes. Efrosini says, the red, white, and black stones remind me that the ancient Greek worshipped the moon as a cow, Io. White, the new moon, red, the harvest moon, and black for the moon when it waned. Also, black, red, and white are stages of alchemy.
Yes, and that's supported by the fact that the priest, according to Plato, sacrificed. They had sacred bulls in the central temple, or in the grounds of the central temple, and they routinely sacrifice these bulls, which makes me think of Mithras, and there's hardly a mystery school that we haven't looked at that where the bull didn't play some prominent part, so yes, and of course the association with the moon is very definite with that. Anyone else? Okay, let's see. Can we get a reader for this, please?
Yes, Yvonne, can you read that for us, please?
The part of Atlantis facing the sea was described as lofty and precipitous, but about the central city was a plain sheltered by mountains, renowned for their size, number, and beauty. The plain yielded 2 crops a year, in the winter being watered by rains, and in the summer by immense irrigation canals, which were also used for transportation. The plain was divided into sections, and in time of war, each section supplied its quota of fighting men and chariots.
Okay, so apropos the discussion we just had, this is about the furthest extension that you get in terms of description. For instance, this last sentence, plain was divided into sections, and in time of war, each section supplied its quota of fighting men and chariots. Well, you're not talking about a few fields here, right? And you're not talking about just the 100,000 acres that immediately surrounded the central city, because to supply a quota of fighting men and chariots would require a vast area. So he's you just have to keep that in mind when you're reading this, right? That most of this seems to be a description of the area immediately surrounding the city. But then when you come to the last part, you realize that these zones must have gone out quite a ways. It must, in fact, have included other islands, other provinces altogether. Any thoughts about this? As to the precipitous seacoast, Donnelly gives us this chart of the Atlantic seafloor from just off the Azores, which many researchers believe to be a likely remnant of Atlantis. It's positioned in the right place on the map. Can we get a reader for this short?
Susan, can you read that for us, please? Okay, we're not hearing her, so let me
Oh,
just.
are you hearing me now? Yeah,
Yep.
sorry
Yeah.
about that. I was waiting for your little button to pop up. One has but to look at the profile of the Dolphin's Ridge as revealed by the deep sea soundings of the Challenger, given as the frontispiece to this volume, to see that this is a faithful description of that precipitous elevation. The surrounding mountains which sheltered the plain from the north are represented in the present towering peaks of the Azores.
Thank you. So the Challenger, you see the illustration on the right there, was a sailing ship with state-of-the-art seafloor mapping. A lot of seafloor mapping going on at this time, the last part of the 19th century. And after which, the Challenger space shuttle was named, by the way. So very well-known ship at its time, and they mapped the Atlantic seafloor. I was certainly part of that group that did. So next up, can we get a reader?
Joan, can you read that for us, please?
The 10 governments differed from each other in details concerning military requirements. Each of the kings of Atlantis had complete control over his own kingdom, but their mutual relationships were governed by a code engraved by the first 10 kings on a column of orichalch standing in the temple of Poseidon. At alternate intervals of 5 and 6 years, a pilgrimage was made to this temple that equal honor might be conferred upon both the odd and the even numbers. Here, with appropriate sacrifice, each king renewed his oath of loyalty upon the sacred inscription. Here also the kings donned azure robes and sat in judgment. At daybreak, they wrote their sentences upon a golden tablet and deposited them with their robes as memorials. The chief laws of the Atlantean kings were that they should not take up arms against each other, and that they should come to the assistance of any of their number who was attacked. In matters of war and great moment, the final decision was in the hands of the direct descendants of the family of Atlas. No king had the power of life and death over his kinsmen without the assent of a majority of the 10.
Thank you. Any thoughts or questions? This certainly opens up to, at least a description of the kingdoms of these 10 kings, right, in terms of their military aspect of it. Okay, let's look at a more detailed account, this one directly from Plato's Critias, of how the 10 kings met and carried out the law in accordance with the code of Poseidon.
Francis?
Yeah.
Sorry. Lynn says, then who were the enemies?
Then who are the enemies? Well, you mean because you're saying that that it covered the entire Earth? There were still all the bordering countries across the sea from Atlantis, and though they're not described, they would have been over a period of millions of years, civilizations that developed and then fell, and were probably in proximity to the king, to those one of those 10 kingdoms of Atlantis. But there's nothing I found so far has described who those enemies may have been. until the very end when they attacked Greece. And that was at the end of that was when Atlantis fell. And we'll get to a description of that. But enemies before that time are not described. Okay, can we get a reader, please? Unless you have another comment.
No, that's the last one. Andrea, can you read that for us, please? Maybe we lost her.
You there, Andrea?
Okay.
No.
Nope,
Okay.
I don't see her. Okay. Lynn, can you read that for us, please?
But when they were about to sit in judgment on anyone, they bound each other by the following compact. As prior to this judicial process, there were bulls in the temple of Neptune, free from all restraint. They selected 10 of these and vowed to the god they would offer a sacrifice which should be acceptable to him. Is a victim taken without iron and hunted with clubs and snares. Hence, whatever bull was caught by them, they led to the pillar and cut its throat on the summit of the column, agreeably to the written mandates. But on the pillar, besides the laws, there was an oath supplicating mighty imprecations against those that were disobedient. When, therefore, sacrificing according to their laws, they began to burn all the members of the bull, they poured out of a full bowl a quantity of clotted blood for each of them, and gave the rest to the fire, and at the same time lustrating the pillar.
Okay, and another reader, please.
After this, drawing out of the bowl and the golden cups, and making a libation in the fire, they took an oath that they would judge according to the laws inscribed on the pillar, and would punish anyone who prior to this should be found guilty. And likewise, that they would never willingly transgress any one of the written mandates. They added that they would neither govern nor be obedient to anyone who governed, contrary to the prescribed laws of their country. When everyone had thus supplicated both for himself and those of his race, after he had drunk and had dedicated the golden cup to the temple of the god, he withdrew to the supper and his necessary concerns. But when it was dark and the fire about the sacrifice was abated, all of them, invested with a most beautiful azure garment and sitting on the ground near the burnt victims, spent the whole night in extinguishing the fire of the sacrifice and in judging and being judged, if any person had accused someone of them having transgressed the laws.
Okay. Yeah, this is a Thomas Taylor translation, which is usually the most intuitive translation. Yes, I see.
Scott, yeah.
Scott?
Maybe it's a more modern way of looking at this, but it seems to me that sacrificing the bulls and drinking the blood would be something that would happen at the very end of Atlantis. It would be more toward black magic and using that kind of blood sacrifice, which I can't imagine was part of the original Atlantis. It would be something toward the end, which might appropriately apply to this Poseidonus. It just seems, it just doesn't seem right for the high part of Atlantis, but more for the low.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Again, that may be, again, looking at the way we do now with blood sacrifices.
Yes.
The way it's done. But maybe back then, at some point, it was good. But
exactly. It's an unbridgeable gulf to go a whole root race and imagine what would be appropriate, know. But I certainly agree with you in current times. this would not be the high expression at all, you know. The only other thing I noticed this time that I didn't last time was that they took their bulls without iron. Isn't iron sacred to Mars generally?
Yes.
Yeah. Suggesting, you know, hunted with clubs and snares. You know, I think of
Which suggests it's a throwback, that they're doing something that was done long ago. to me.
yeah, there's that, and there's also the idea that, you know, they're leaving the Martian motive or intent out of it, that it's done, you could say, impersonally. You know, who knows?
They don't cut the throat with a club or a snare.
Well, that's true, isn't it? But they, you know, they could have obsidian easily.
I suppose. Yeah.
Bulls in the Temple of Neptune, which of course is Poseidon. Okay, yeah. Anyone else? Any thoughts?
Joan,
Um,
yeah.
With the bull, do you think there's any connection with Taurus?
I would say there couldn't not be, but you know, we just don't know what that might have been. Certainly, any age would have been, you know, I mean, the Atlantean root race lasted for so long and so many cycles that it couldn't be particular to a cycle of Taurus. But who knows? You know, if somebody has, I see Jeremy has a hand up. Go ahead. BL, you want to call
Yeah,
in?
go ahead, Jeremy. He actually typed in a question too. He said, are there any references in these resources on Atlantis about the generating of the veil, which separated the worlds? Is that what you wanted to say, Jeremy?
Yes, thank you.
We're going to be getting to a section in the Atlantis and Interpretation by MPH that talks about the levels of the airy, watery, and earthy levels ruled by three planets, and how they moved from one to the next. But that's the only reference to veils. There's a lot of reference to veils in Greek mythology and its use in that way. But no, not. I'm sorry.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Anything else?
I think that's it right now.
Okay. So can we get a reader for this section? We've turned the page here.
Oops, Carrie, can you read that for us, please?
Plato concludes his description by declaring that it was this great empire which attacked the Hellenic states. This did not occur, however, until their power and glory had lured the Atlantean kings from the pathway of wisdom and virtue. Filled with false ambition, the rulers of Atlantis determined to conquer the entire world. Zeus, perceiving the wickedness of the Atlanteans, gathered the gods into his holy habitation and addressed them. Here, Plato's narrative comes to an abrupt end, for the Critias was never finished. In the Timaeus is a further description of Atlantis, supposedly given to Solon by an Egyptian priest, and which concludes as follows. But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of rain all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared and was sunk beneath the sea. And that is the reason why the sea in those parts is impossible and impenetrable, because there is such a quantity of shallow mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of the island.
Thank you, Carrie. Any thoughts or questions on this paragraph?
A prior one. the discussion earlier. Efrosini says the desire would be very strong in the Atlanteans. Taurus is a symbol of strong desire. That is why they place such emphasis on the law and on discipline and the magic ceremony in order to comply with the law.
I like that. Yeah, thanks for that observation. I like that a lot. Yeah. Yeah, just the desire aspect alone, would elevate Taurus in that way. Good one. Anyone else?
Nope.
Okay, addressing the Hellenic War with Atlantis, 19th century German classical scholar August Bock wrote the following in his commentary on the Platonic doctrine. Could we get a reader for this shorty?
Scott, can you read that for us, please?
Okay. In the greater Panathenai.
Panathenea.
Panathenea, okay, that sounds better. It was carried in procession a peplum of Minerva, representing the war with the giants and the victory of the gods of Olympus. In the lesser Panathenea, they carried another peplum covered with symbolic devices, which showed how the Athenians, supported by Minerva, had the advantage in the war with the Atlantes.
Okay. Any thoughts about this? It's nice to have some historical reference within the Greek historical records of recognition outside of Plato, right? There seems to be some support here in this.
This is pre-Hellenic world that we know of. It's pre-classical Greek.
That's so true. That is so true.
Combining it into what the Acropolis here is probably not accurate, but it's interesting. Well, maybe that's when it was done with some reference or remembrance of that. Is that what they're saying?
Yeah, the Panathenaic Festival recognized this ancient event is what I'm showing here. So this picture here is of the festival, right, which lasted even to 300 AD, right? And in that festival, they carried this peplum, which recognized this ancient event of the defeat of the Atlantes. Make sense? Okay.
Yvonne asks, what is a peplum?
Yes, the peplum is the garment of Athena, which is that very peculiar Greek garment that you see on so many Greek statues of goddesses. Yeah, that's all I can. It's hard to describe clothing. Free-flowing, and they used it as Athena's peplum as a sail on one of the boats, and therefore bringing in the idea of air, because as you know, Athena was born from the mind of Zeus, bringing in the air quality, and so they would use it as a sail during the festival, and the boat was literally rolled along on land with this giant peplum of Athena, which otherwise was her garb in the great temple of Athena, right?
Yeah. Aren't they mixing their Greeks and their Romans here? You're saying Athena, which I believe is correct for Greece, and isn't Minerva the Roman version of her?
Yeah, and yeah, you have to look at that was common in the late 19th century here, but Minerva, yeah, is is Athena, so no problem. Same person.
Right.
So, yeah.
Just different context, but
different context, and it would have been very, very specifically a Greek festival, not a Roman one, I see Christine.
yeah, her hand just went down. Did you? did you have a question, Christine?
Hang on. I'm glad she asked that question because a peplum today is actually the flounce on a blouse. It fits over the hip.
Huh, interesting. Okay, well,
That way it wouldn't be a sail.
no, it certainly wouldn't. And it's changed its meaning. Because the peplum really was the upper garment of Athena.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then Lynn says, does this mean that oops, wait a minute. I have to adjust okay. Does this mean at this point, the incoming first races of the Aryan race were here?
Yes, the Aryan race was established in India and Egypt and Chaldea. Now, exactly the order, according to HPB, there was an Aryan brotherhood that established it through the Hindu white brotherhood earliest, but that it had its expression in both Chaldea and Egypt almost simultaneously. So yes, the Aryan race would have been established before the end of the fourth root race. In other words, they're not strictly sequential, but certainly the fact of the ending of the fourth root race would have initiated the beginning of the fifth, even if it happened before that last vestige of the fourth went down.
And then Ephrosyne says maybe the goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom in Athens, represents the fifth tribe that surpassed the fourth in its fall, the fifth race.
I like that. Certainly, when you think of her as springing from the mind of Zeus, and that Zeus represents, the three lower subplanes, you had Zeus Amon, which was Zeus expressing itself as Jupiter. You had Zeus Neptune or Poseidon expressing itself on the watery plane. And then you have Zeus Hades, which was physical expression. So this would be the highest level of that through Athena and would definitely be a fifth root race. The number 5 is sacred to Athena. So the fifth root race and Athena, I think, would be very much tied. Yeah, good one. Anyone else?
I think so. Let me see. Janet says from Athena was offered the olive branch, and she won against Neptune, who offered the horse, which represents power.
There you have it. Yeah. Yeah, that's the kind of symbology that shows that passage from one race to the next. Yeah. Also suggests that the olive branch was indicative of the fifth root race. Anyone else? Okay. In an article from MPH's All Seeing Eye, the author gives us more insight into the causes of Atlantis's fall, which we had just read about here, right? The end of the Timaeus talked about these violent earthquakes and floods. And in a single day, of course, it makes you wonder because the earth was created in 7 days, right? So this can be a metaphor for a longer period. But nonetheless, Plato did say in a single day and night, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the manner and the island of Atlantis in a like manner disappeared. Yes, Christine, I'm seeing that.
I'm working my buttons. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The only reason I'm interjecting again is because the story was told that Atlantis went down because the Dark Lords used their electromagnetic weapons. In other words, they abused their knowledge of power. Is there any truth to that?
Well, again, you have three sources. You have Plato, who doesn't specifically say that, but then you have much from both MPH, HPB, and DK on the subject, and we're about to answer your question. Not exactly in terms of the type of weapons, but the whole reason for Atlantis' submergence. MPH really takes on here in this article from the All-Seeing Eye. So why don't you, Christine, read the first one, if you don't mind.
Beginning, a discussion of Atlantis would be incomplete without a brief outline of the causes for its disappearance. The great king, Vitat, I don't know, the invisible dragon, now that's interesting, is unquestionably what Eliphas Levi would call the astral light, the same force which the Knights Templar were accused of worshiping under the form of the goat of Mendes. The astral light is the seat of sorcery, or what the ancients termed infernal magic. The ruler of this sphere is the great fire prince Samael, who is supposed to have taken upon himself the form of a serpent and seduced Eve. Wow, this is getting deep. His sphere is ruled by Mars, or more correctly symbolized by it. And his key word is ambition. The Atlanteans were in natural clairvoyance, or it might be better to say natural mediums. They could see the invisible worlds, but they did not understand the proper use of the great forces of the astral light. The Atlanteans, like the medium, did not possess supernatural power technically. They were possessed by it. They were moved by the astral king like a Ouija board, and as this sphere was one of excess and fury, he poured forth his qualities through them until the whole civilization collapsed in a common ruin. Before the destruction of the continent, the Atlanteans were divided, for in a portion of the people was born the realization of personal responsibility.
Thank you, Christine. Fascinating stuff. Another reader, please. This continues.
Yvonne.
Excuse me. These escaped from the rulership of the Dragon King and, obeying the instructions of the Great White Lord, prepared for themselves a better destiny. When the destruction came and the fire which the sorcerers had invoked consumed them, the white adepts, led by the great father of the Thinkitheans, Noah, escaped and established themselves in those lands which had survived the great destruction. The demon king, Thevatot, did not always control Atlantis. He gradually gained dominion over it, as an evil habit gradually gains control of a human life. He finally obsessed Atlantis and those of Atlantean adepts, and those of the Atlantean adepts, superior beings who incarnated in Atlantis to protect the people who could no longer protect the continent from the demon of the astral light, became the leaders of the several migrations. These adepts were also termed serpents, but with them, the serpent had been raised as is described in the Bible. It had not lost its feet as shown in the Egyptian glyphs, and it wore the feather of Mot, the symbol of truth. Quetzalcoatl, whose proper symbol is an upraised snake and who carried the cross, was one of the white adepts, for it is declared in the codices that he was a white man, a term which may not necessarily mean color, but rather purity.
Thank you. So, any thoughts or questions? This page describes the Dark Brotherhood and the source of this great dark supernatural potency in King Tevitat, who seemed to be in league with this fire prince Samael. And then you have this chilling line. They were moved by the astral king like a Ouija boards, and his sphere was one of excess fury. Right? And then you have the Great White Lord, who prepared those who aligned themselves with him for the Exodus, which happened in all directions. And we'll be taking a look at some good evidence, I think some very convincing evidence of some of these movements to other lands. Any thoughts or questions about this section? Okay. Next up, can we get a reader?
Joan, can you read that, please?
Oops.
There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. In the introduction to his translation of the Timaeus, Thomas Taylor quotes from a history of Ethiopia written by Marcellus, which contains the following reference to Atlantis. For they relate that in their time, there were 7 islands in the Atlantic Sea, sacred to Proserpina. And besides these, 3 others of an immense magnitude, one of which was sacred to Pluto, another to Ammon, and another, which is the middle of these, and is of 1,000 stadia, to Neptune. Crantor, commenting upon Plato, asserted that the Egyptian priests declared the story of Atlantis to be written upon pillars, which were still preserved circa 300 BC. See Beginnings or Glimpses of Vanished Civilizations. Ignatius Donnelly, who gave the subject of Atlantis profound study, believed that horses were first domesticated by the Atlanteans, for which reason they have always been considered peculiarly sacred to Poseidon. See Atlantis.
Thank you. So, NPH considers the meaning of the 3 large and 7 small islands in an upcoming paragraph, so we won't tackle that now. We learned a bit more about the philosopher Crantor's assertion in this quote from the same issue of the All-Seeing Eye by NPH. Could we get a reader for this, please?
Joe, can you read that for us, please?
Sure. The Egyptian priest Osiris told Solon that the accounts of Atlantis, which they possessed, had been deciphered from inscriptions upon ancient columns. These pillars, composed of some unknown and imperishable substance, possibly the fabled Pillars of Enoch, had been erected before the deluge. In fact, the columns had been constructed for the express purpose of withstanding the terrific upheavals which were to lay barren a considerable part of the earth. Crantor, writing circa 300 BC, declared that at that time the pillars were still in existence.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, next up.
Hold on. We got a comment from Efrosini. She says, We can think of how strong the wound of humanity would be with the predominance of black magic and what wickedness that would have reached. I wonder how much longer we are still experiencing this trauma. Somewhere the Tibetan had written that World War II was a revival of this wound, but with a good outcome. Maybe this also happens in the crises of our own lives.
Yeah, well, let's hope so, with the good outcome part anyway. Certainly the fifth root race is, you could say, laced with the karma of the fourth, especially because it wasn't able to finish its tenure. It only lasted four sub races and did turn the corner into the fifth, sixth, and seventh, which are the ascending sub races of any race, right? Well, we have turned the corner. We're in the fifth sub race of the fifth root race, but we still have tremendous Atlantean karma,
Yes.
having a lot to do with the emotional polarity. That's just part of it. Okay, can we get a reader, please?
I said.
I'll read it. From a careful consideration of Plato's description of Atlantis, it is evident that the story should not be regarded as wholly historical, but rather as both allegorical and historical. Origin, Porphyry, Proclus, him, and Syrianus realized that the story concealed a profound philosophical mystery, but they disagreed as to the actual interpretation. Plato's Atlantis symbolizes the threefold nature of both the universe and the human body. The 10 kings of Atlantis are the tetractys, or numbers, which are born of the 5 pairs of opposites. Consult Theon of Smyrna for the Pythagorean doctrine of opposites. The numbers 1 to 10 rule every creature, and the numbers in turn are under the control of the monad, or one, the eldest among them.
Okay, any thoughts or questions about this paragraph? Okay, next time we're going to be taking a look at MPH's interpretation of the allegory of Atlantis, an extended look, in fact, and using this chart that I mentioned earlier. So this is a good time to pull the plug, and we can start with that next time with MPH's really in-depth analysis of the elements and the personages, the gods that ruled Atlantis, and of the entire sweep of the history of Atlantis in accordance with those elements. So until then, I see Trudy.
Right. Hold on. Go ahead, Trudy.
I just wanted to say thank you for your wonderful interpretations. That's all, really.
Oh, well, thank you, Trudy.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. Yeah, it's a real pleasure for me to be with you all and share this really wonderful subject matter. That it's easy to just not come across this. You have to dig a little bit to come into this material, and it's just wonderful to be able to share this with you. It's like I said, it's a real privilege to work with you all. So appreciate it. BL, do you want to give dates?
Right. So our next Secret Teaching of All Ages is on the 1st of August at 7. And of course, coming up in 2 weeks on the 18th of July, we have the next Secret Doctrine.
Terrific. So we're right in 2-week increments for the next,
Okay.
and then 2 more weeks. So, okay, terrific. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Francis.